When did the honor code turn against you? The dean's hand was shaking when she slid the printed pages across the mahogany table. Your submitted ethics paper on one side, an article from a medical journal website on the other. Highlighted sections covered both documents like yellow disease, sections that matched word for word according to the plagiarism software. I stared at sentences I'd supposedly copied directly from Dr. Rebecca Foster's 2020 article about physician-assisted suicide. Sentences I had no memory of ever reading before in my life. But let me back up, because this morning started normal. I woke up at 6:30 to my phone alarm playing that generic chime I'd been meaning to change for months. Devin was already gone to early lacrosse practice, his protein shake container sitting empty in the sink. I made coffee and ate cereal while reviewing my organic chemistry notes one last time before the exam at 8 WO. My laptop was open on the kitchen table showing my email inbox with the usual spam about campus events and library fines I needed to pay. Then at 6:47, a new email arrived that made my stomach drop before I'd even finished my first sip of coffee. Subject line read, Mandatory Meeting, Honor Council, 9 a.m. today. The sender was Dean Patricia Whitmore, chair of the University Honor Council, and the body was just 2 sentences. You are required to appear before the Honor Council regarding academic integrity violation case number 2847. Failure to attend will result in automatic expulsion per university policy. I read it 3 times with milk dripping from my spoon back into the bowl. Academic integrity violation? I'd never cheated on anything in my entire life. 4 years at Davidson University, 3.9 GPA, president of the Pre-Med Society, volunteer at the campus clinic every weekend helping underserved patients. My medical school applications were already submitted to Hopkins, Stanford, and Penn. Early decision results were supposed to come in 2 weeks, and my professors had assured me my chances were excellent. This had to be some administrative error, student IDs getting mixed up in the university database. Devin came back from practice while I was staring at the email, grabbing a second protein shake from the fridge. He took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I turned my laptop toward him and he read the message, his expression shifting from confused to genuinely concerned. He said the Honor Council didn't send those emails unless they had serious evidence of something major. His cousin had gotten one last year for plagiarizing an entire paper from an online essay mill, and they'd expelled him within a week. The university took academic integrity incredibly seriously because their reputation depended on it. I told him there had to be some mistake because I hadn't done anything wrong. Devin sat down across from me and asked if I was absolutely sure, if maybe I'd accidentally cited something incorrectly or forgotten to include a reference on one of my papers. I mentally went through every assignment from the past semester. Biochemistry problem sets, advanced statistics projects, medical ethics papers, everything had been my own work. I'd spent entire nights in the library working through concepts, had my study group check citations before submitting anything, used plagiarism checkers on my own before turning in major papers. There was literally nothing that could trigger an integrity violation. The organic chemistry exam started at 8, but there was no way I could focus on reaction mechanisms and molecular structures when my entire future was potentially imploding. I emailed Professor Hammond asking to reschedule due to a family emergency, which was technically a lie, but felt justified given the circumstances. She responded within minutes, saying I could take the exam Friday morning instead, and hoped everything was okay with my family. The guilt about lying to her hit immediately because she'd been one of my strongest recommendation letter writers for medical school, had spent hours helping me craft my personal statement about wanting to work in underserved communities. The Honor Council met in Whitman Hall, the oldest building on campus with tall stone columns and oak doors that probably weighed 1,000 pounds each. I arrived at 8:45, way too early, and sat on a wooden bench outside the hearing room, watching other students walk past to their morning classes. Everyone looked normal and relaxed, carrying coffee cups and backpacks, complaining about problem sets and talking about parties over the weekend. My hands wouldn't stop shaking and I kept checking my phone even though there was nothing to check. At exactly 9, the heavy hearing room door opened, and a woman in her 50s wearing a gray pantsuit gestured for me to enter. She introduced herself as Dean Patricia Whitmore, chair of the Honor Council, and led me to a table in the center of a room that felt specifically designed to intimidate. High ceilings with exposed wooden beams, portraits of former university presidents staring down from the walls with disapproving expressions, and a long table where 5 people sat watching me like I'd already been convicted. 3 faculty members I didn't recognize, 1 student representative who I'd seen around campus but never actually met, and Dean Whitmore taking her position at the center like a judge. She told me to sit in the single chair facing their tribunal table and asked if I understood why I was there. I said no, honestly, that the email mentioned an academic integrity violation but gave absolutely no details about what I supposedly did wrong or which class it even involved. Dean Whitmore opened a thick folder in front of her and pulled out stapled papers, sliding them across the polished table toward me. The top page showed my name, student ID number, and course information for advanced medical ethics, Professor Leonard Ashford's upper-level seminar that only 20 students were selected for each semester. Below that was a plagiarism report generated by the university's detection software, showing 89% similarity to an online source. My chest tightened looking at those numbers. 89% was absolutely damning, the kind of percentage that screamed guilty without any room for interpretation. But I'd written that ethics paper myself over Thanksgiving break, had spent 2 solid weeks researching physician-assisted suicide laws across different states, interviewing a hospice nurse my mom knew from her hospital work, reading court cases about terminal patients seeking death with dignity. I looked up at Dean Whitmore and told her there had to be some kind of error with the plagiarism software because I wrote every single word of that paper myself from my own research. She pulled out more pages from the folder, these ones showing my submitted paper side by side with an article published on a medical ethics website 3 years ago. The passages were highlighted in bright yellow, showing sentence after sentence that matched almost word for word. My eyes scanned through them, and I felt sick because they really did look identical. The same arguments about patient autonomy and dignity in end-of-life care. The same case studies about terminal patients in Oregon and Washington choosing physician-assisted suicide. The same concluding paragraphs about balancing individual rights against medical ethics. But I'd never seen this article before in my life, had no memory of even visiting whatever website it came from. Professor Ashford spoke up from his position at the end of the table, his voice cold and deeply disappointed. He said he'd been teaching at Davidson for 23 years, and this was honestly one of the most blatant cases of plagiarism he'd ever encountered in his entire career. He explained that when grading my paper, he'd noticed it seemed unusually polished, too professional and sophisticated compared to my normal writing style in previous assignments. So he'd run it through the university's plagiarism detection system as a precaution, and the results came back immediately flagging massive sections as copied directly from that website article. I tried to explain that maybe we'd both use the same primary sources, that when multiple people research the same topic, they naturally arrive at similar conclusions and arguments. Dean Whitmore cut me off saying the similarities weren't just in ideas or general arguments, but in exact sentence structure and specific phrasing. She read one example aloud, first from the website article, then from my submitted paper. They were completely identical except I'd changed maybe 3 or 4 words total. She asked how I could possibly explain that level of similarity without having directly copied the source material. My mind was racing, trying to understand what had happened. I genuinely remembered writing that paper in the apartment I shared with Devin and 2 other guys. Remembered researching late at night when everyone else was asleep. Remembered typing out arguments about patient autonomy. Remembered revising the conclusion multiple times to get the tone right. But the evidence sitting in front of me on that table contradicted everything I remembered about the writing process. I told them I honestly didn't know how this happened, but I swore on everything I cared about that I'd written that paper myself and never intentionally plagiarized anything. The student representative leaned forward, and I finally recognized her as Julia Chen, a senior who ran the Campus Activist Coalition and was always organizing protests about university policies. She asked in a surprisingly gentle voice if anyone else had access to my laptop or my Davidson student account credentials. I said no. My laptop was password protected, and I never shared my login information with anyone because we'd been warned about account security since freshman orientation. Julia pressed further, asking if my roommates ever used my computer or if I'd left it unattended in public places like the library or student center. I admitted that, yeah, sometimes I left my laptop in the library when I went downstairs to get coffee from the campus Starbucks or walked across the building to use the bathroom. But it locked automatically after 5 minutes of inactivity, required my password to get back in, so I'd never worried about security. Julia made a note on her pad and exchanged a glance with Dean Whitmore that I couldn't interpret. The silence in that room felt suffocating, broken only by the sound of pens scratching on paper as the faculty members took notes. Dean Whitmore folded her hands on top of my plagiarism report and explained the honor code investigation process in bureaucratic language that made everything feel more terrifying. She said they'd already gathered preliminary evidence, which was why I'd been called to this hearing, and now they needed to determine whether a violation had actually occurred and what consequences would be appropriate if I was found responsible. If found guilty of plagiarism, the standard penalty was a failing grade in the course and a permanent notation on my academic record visible to any institution requesting transcripts. In severe cases, which this appeared to be given the extremely high percentage of copied material, the council could recommend suspension or full expulsion from the university. The word expulsion hit me like a physical punch to the chest. 4 years of incredibly hard work, countless nights studying until 3 a.m., volunteering at the clinic every weekend instead of going to parties, building a resume specifically designed for medical school admissions, all of it potentially destroyed in one morning. I leaned forward in my chair and told them as calmly as I could manage that I understood how bad the evidence looked, but I absolutely needed them to believe me that I didn't intentionally plagiarize anything. Maybe I'd made some terrible mistake in my note-taking process. Maybe I'd copied passages while researching and somehow forgotten they weren't my original words. But I would never deliberately cheat because my entire future depended on my academic integrity. Professor Ashford shook his head slowly, looking more sad than angry. He said my explanation about accidental note-taking mistakes didn't hold up because the plagiarized sections were integrated throughout the entire paper, forming the core arguments and analysis. This wasn't a case of accidentally forgetting to cite 1 or 2 quotes properly. This was systematic copying of someone else's intellectual work and presenting it as my own original thinking. He added that he felt personally betrayed because he'd written me an extremely strong recommendation letter for medical school based on the quality of work I'd consistently shown in his class, work he now had to seriously question the authenticity of. That statement made my stomach turn violently. My recommendation letters were already sent to Hopkins, Stanford, and Penn, already sitting in admissions offices as part of my application files. If this violation went on my permanent record, those medical schools would all be officially notified. Hopkins would immediately rescind their consideration of my application. Stanford would throw my entire file straight into the rejection pile. Penn wouldn't even bother reviewing my credentials. My entire future in medicine would evaporate before it even had a chance to begin, destroyed by plagiarism accusations for a paper I knew I'd written myself. I asked if I could actually see the original article they claimed I'd copied from, to read through it carefully myself, instead of just looking at highlighted sections. Dean Whitmore turned her laptop screen toward me, showing the medical ethics website where the article was published. It was titled, Autonomy and Dignity in End-of-Life Care, a Framework for Physician-Assisted Suicide, and published by someone named Dr. Rebecca Foster in March 2020. I started reading through it carefully and felt increasingly disoriented because yes, the arguments absolutely matched mine almost exactly. The case studies matched. Even some of the specific transitional phrases between paragraphs matched. But I had absolutely no memory of ever reading this particular article during my research process. The faculty member sitting to Dean Whitmore's left, an older man with white hair whose nameplate read, Professor Douglas, asked if I'd used any AI writing tools or paper mill services to generate content for my assignments. I said absolutely not, that I knew those were explicitly forbidden under the honor code, and I'd never even considered using them because the risk wasn't worth it. Professor Douglas raised his eyebrows like he didn't believe a single word I was saying, commenting that students always claimed complete ignorance when caught cheating, that denial was the most common defense strategy they encountered. Julia Chen, the student representative, interjected and suggested they should at least investigate whether this could potentially be a case of deliberate frame-up, that she'd read articles about incidents at other universities where students sabotaged each other's work out of jealousy or competition. Dean Whitmore acknowledged it was theoretically possible, but emphasized that the burden of proof would fall entirely on me to demonstrate someone else had accessed my work and deliberately altered it. She asked directly if I had any concrete evidence suggesting that scenario might have occurred. I didn't have anything. I had nothing except my own insistence that I'd written the paper myself and never encountered Dr. Foster's article during my research. No proof of hacking, no suspicious login records, no witnesses who could verify someone else had tampered with my work. Dean Whitmore closed her folder with a definitive sound that felt like a door slamming shut on my future. She said the council would deliberate privately and notify me of their official decision within 48 hours maximum. In the meantime, I was expected to continue attending my other classes, but should refrain from submitting any major assignments until the case was fully resolved. The hearing was officially over. Walking out of Whitman Hall into bright October sunshine felt completely surreal. Students were still walking to their classes like normal, still laughing about weekend plans and complaining about upcoming midterms, still living in a world where their futures were secure and intact. I felt like I was moving underwater, everything muffled and distant. I pulled out my phone and called my dad even though it was barely 10 a.m., and he'd definitely be at work at the law firm where he'd been a partner for over 20 years. He answered on the third ring, asking what was wrong with immediate concern in his voice, because I never called him during work hours unless something serious had happened. I told him everything as coherently as I could manage. The email this morning, the Honor Council hearing, the plagiarism evidence showing 89% similarity to an online article. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then he asked me directly, as my father and as a lawyer, if I had actually copied that paper from anywhere. I said no, absolutely not, that I had no idea how this had happened, but I desperately needed his help figuring it out. He told me to send him everything I had related to that paper, all my research notes, all my draft versions, every single piece of documentation I'd saved during the writing process. He said, if this situation went badly and the council ruled against me, we would need to lawyer up immediately and fight it through the university's appeals process with everything we had. We weren't going to let a false accusation destroy 4 years of perfect academic work. The idea that I might actually need to hire a lawyer to defend myself against my own university made everything feel exponentially more real and terrifying. My dad said he'd start making calls to colleagues who specialized in education law and told me very firmly not to talk to anyone else about the case without consulting him first. No conversations with other students, no detailed explanations to professors, nothing that could potentially be used against me later. After we hung up, I just stood there on the steps of Whitman Hall for probably 10 minutes, watching people walk past and wondering how my life had turned into a legal nightmare, literally overnight. I walked back to my apartment in a complete daze, passing the massive library where I'd spent probably 1,000 hours studying over 4 years, passing the campus clinic where I volunteered every Saturday and Sunday morning, taking patient histories and helping the attending physicians with basic procedures, passing the Pre-Med Society office where we held study sessions and practiced for the MCAT together. Everything looked exactly the same as yesterday but felt completely different now, like I was seeing my campus life through glass that was about to shatter. Devin was home when I finally got there, having skipped his afternoon economics class to wait for me. I collapsed on our worn couch and told him it was significantly worse than I'd imagined possible. They had evidence showing massive plagiarism, the council seemed completely convinced of my guilt, and they were actively deliberating whether to expel me from the university entirely. Devin looked genuinely shocked because he'd known me for 3 years, had been my roommate that entire time, and he said I was literally the most honest and hardworking person he'd ever met in his life. There had to be some rational explanation for what happened. I pulled out my laptop and navigated to Dr. Rebecca Foster's article, reading through it extremely carefully this time without 5 people watching my every reaction. The arguments about patient autonomy were definitely similar to mine, but those were also the standard arguments that literally anyone studying medical ethics would encounter in their research. The case studies about Oregon and Washington were matters of public record, cited in dozens of academic papers and court documents. But the sentence structure, the specific word choices, the particular way arguments were phrased and connected, those similarities were way too close to be mere coincidence. Something suddenly occurred to me, and I opened my Google Docs account where I'd written the paper originally. Google Docs automatically tracked every single edit with precise timestamps, showing exactly when text was added, deleted, or modified. I navigated to my medical ethics paper and clicked on the version history, watching the revision timeline load on my screen. My pulse started racing as I scrolled through the editing sessions. The document showed I'd started writing on November 18th, a Saturday afternoon right after Thanksgiving break ended. There were dozens of editing sessions over the following 2 weeks, showing steady progress as I developed my arguments and incorporated research. I could see myself working on it almost every day, sometimes for just 30 minutes, sometimes for 3 or 4 hours at a time. Everything looked completely normal and consistent with how I remembered writing the paper. But then on December 2nd at 11:47 p.m., there was a massive revision session where entire paragraphs were suddenly deleted and replaced with completely different text. I clicked on that specific revision and watched my screen show my original writing disappearing, being systematically replaced with the plagiarized sections from Dr. Foster's article. Paragraph after paragraph of my actual work vanishing and being swapped out with copied content. But I vividly remembered December 2nd. That was the night I'd submitted my final version to Professor Ashford through the course portal and gone straight to bed around 11 p.m., absolutely exhausted from finishing. Someone had accessed my Google Docs account after I'd gone to sleep and deliberately swapped out my original work with plagiarized content. Someone who knew my schedule well enough to know when I'd be unconscious and unable to notice the unauthorized access. Someone who wanted to destroy my academic career specifically and had planned this attack carefully. Devin looked over my shoulder at the revision history displayed on my laptop screen and said this was definitive proof that someone else had altered my paper. I needed to take this evidence to the Honor Council immediately, show them I'd been deliberately framed by someone with access to my account. I took multiple screenshots of the revision history, carefully saved the original pre-December 2nd version of my paper showing my actual work, and composed a detailed email to Dean Whitmore explaining exactly what I'd discovered. Her response arrived back in less than an hour, which surprised me given how busy she probably was. She thanked me for providing the additional information and said the council would definitely review it carefully during their deliberation process. However, she noted that the revision history only showed changes made within my own personal account, which meant either I had made those changes myself or someone had somehow obtained my login credentials. She asked if I had any concrete evidence suggesting unauthorized access to my account, such as login attempts from unknown IP addresses or access from unfamiliar physical locations. I immediately went to my Davidson account security settings and found the activity log that tracked every single login for the past 6 months. Most entries were completely familiar, showing logins from my laptop or my phone, from locations I recognized like my apartment, various spots around campus, the library, the campus clinic. But there, on December 2nd at 11:51 p.m., was a login from an IP address I absolutely didn't recognize, showing my account being accessed from somewhere off campus. 4 minutes later at 11:55 p.m., that same unfamiliar IP address logged out of my account. This was concrete evidence of someone else accessing my account without authorization, definitive proof that I'd been deliberately framed by someone who'd broken into my Google account specifically to sabotage my ethics paper. I screenshot the login activity with shaking hands and sent it to Dean Whitmore immediately with a follow-up email explaining that someone had clearly hacked into my account to destroy my work and my academic reputation. I expected immediate relief, vindication, maybe even an apology for putting me through this nightmare hearing. Instead, her response was frustratingly cautious and bureaucratic. She said the council would investigate the unfamiliar IP address further and determine its origin, but she noted that students frequently accessed their accounts from various off-campus locations, like coffee shops, restaurants, or friends' apartments where they studied. This made it difficult to definitively prove that any specific login was actually unauthorized, rather than just me accessing my own account from a location I'd forgotten about. The council would need more substantial evidence to conclusively establish that my account had been compromised by someone else. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow highlighted sections covering my paper, heard Professor Ashford's disappointed voice saying he felt personally betrayed, felt the crushing weight of my destroyed medical school future pressing down on my chest. Around 2 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep entirely and started thinking through who could have possibly done this to me. It had to be someone who knew my class schedule well enough to know when I'd submitted that paper, someone who knew my sleep patterns well enough to know when I'd be unconscious and unable to notice account tampering, someone who had both the technical knowledge to hack into my Google account and a strong motive to want to destroy my academic career specifically. One name kept surfacing through my exhausted, racing thoughts: Ethan Caldwell. We'd been genuinely close friends during freshman and sophomore year, both enrolled in the pre-med track, both competing for top grades in the same brutally difficult science classes. But junior year, something had shifted in our friendship. We'd both applied for a highly competitive research position with Dr. Morrison, the head of the biology department who was doing groundbreaking work on cellular regeneration. The position only accepted one undergraduate student per year and came with a substantial stipend, plus guaranteed co-authorship on any published papers. I'd gotten the position over Ethan. Dr. Morrison had told me later that it had been an extremely close decision, that both our applications were excellent, but my research proposal had been slightly more innovative. Ethan had congratulated me when the decision was announced, had even taken me out for coffee to celebrate, but his smile never quite reached his eyes, and his handshake felt cold and perfunctory. After that, our friendship had gradually cooled into something tense and awkward and competitive. We still saw each other regularly in shared classes and at pre-med society events, but the easy camaraderie and late-night study sessions completely disappeared. This past semester, we'd both been enrolled in Professor Ashford's Advanced Medical Ethics Seminar, one of the most selective courses the university offered. Ethan's final paper on physician-assisted suicide had received an A-, which was still an excellent grade by any reasonable standard. Mine, before the plagiarism accusation destroyed everything, had been graded as a straight A. Professor Ashford had even commented during our last class session that my paper showed exceptional insight and sophisticated analysis, that he planned to use it as an example for future students studying end-of-life medical ethics. Ethan had been sitting just 3 seats away during that announcement, and I'd noticed his jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack from the pressure. The more I thought about the timeline and the circumstances, the more it made perfect sense. Ethan had clear motive because of the ongoing academic competition between us. He had opportunity because we'd been close friends who'd studied together for 2 years, plenty of chances to observe my passwords or install monitoring software on my laptop, and he had the technical skills to pull off the hack because he was a computer science minor who frequently talked about security vulnerabilities and how easy it was to compromise people's accounts if you knew what you were doing. But accusing Ethan without having concrete proof connecting him to the unauthorized login would make me look desperate and vindictive, especially since we'd been friends and everyone on campus knew about our history. I needed actual evidence, something tangible that would prove he was responsible for framing me. Just my suspicions and circumstantial reasoning wouldn't be enough to convince the Honor Council or protect my academic future. Friday morning, I completely skipped the rescheduled organic chemistry exam that Professor Hammond had graciously arranged for me. There was absolutely no point in taking it now that I was potentially facing suspension or expulsion, now that my medical school applications were about to be torpedoed by plagiarism notifications. Instead, I went directly to the campus IT department as soon as their office opened at 8 a.m., hoping someone there could help me trace that suspicious IP address and figure out who'd accessed my account. The student worker at the reception desk looked profoundly bored until I explained I believed my university account had been compromised and used to deliberately sabotage my academic work. She immediately perked up and directed me to a back office where the full-time IT security specialist worked. His name was Gordon, and he was probably in his early 30s, wearing a Davidson Tech Services polo shirt and surrounded by multiple monitors displaying system logs and security alerts that looked like something out of a cybersecurity movie. I explained my entire situation as clearly as I could: the plagiarism accusation, the Google Docs revision history showing my work being replaced hours after I'd submitted it, the login from an unfamiliar IP address on December 2nd at 11:51 p.m. Gordon pulled up my account history on one of his monitors and examined the unauthorized login entry carefully, zooming in on the IP address details and cross-referencing it with the university's network database. He said the IP address that had accessed my account belonged to a coffee shop called The Grind, located about 2 miles off campus in the downtown area. It was a popular spot for Davidson students because they had reliable high-speed Wi-Fi, comfortable seating, and stayed open until midnight most weeknights. Gordon checked the specific timestamp of 11:51 p.m. and commented that it actually narrowed things down significantly, since not many students would be at a coffee shop that late on a weeknight when most people were either studying in their rooms or sleeping. I asked if there was any possible way to find out specifically who else had been at The Grind that night, using their Wi-Fi network around the same time my account was accessed. Gordon shook his head, saying that would require direct cooperation from the coffee shop's internet service provider and probably a warrant or subpoena from law enforcement. However, he noted that most students who connected to public Wi-Fi networks inevitably left digital footprints through the various apps and services they accessed while connected. If I could narrow down my list of potential suspects, he might be able to check university logs to see whether their registered devices had connected to the Grind's network that specific night. Walking out of the IT office, I felt the first genuine spark of hope since this nightmare had begun Wednesday morning. I needed to find concrete proof that Ethan had been physically present at the Grind coffee shop on December 2nd around midnight. If I could establish that, combined with the evidence of the unauthorized login from that exact location and time, it would build an extremely strong case that he'd deliberately framed me for plagiarism. My phone buzzed with an email notification as I was crossing the quad. Message from Professor Ashford asking me to come to his office at 2 p.m. that afternoon. The tone was formal and cold, completely different from the friendly and encouraging messages he'd sent me throughout the semester when he'd been actively mentoring me toward medical school. His office was in the science building on the 3rd floor, overlooking the quad where students were throwing frisbees and studying on blankets despite the chilly November weather. Professor Ashford was sitting behind his desk when I arrived at exactly 2, surrounded by towering stacks of papers and thick books on medical ethics that I'd once found fascinating and intellectually stimulating, but now just reminded me of my completely destroyed future. He gestured curtly for me to sit in the chair across from his desk and got straight to the point without any pleasantries or small talk. He said he'd been contacted that morning by someone from Hopkins's admissions office, asking detailed questions about the academic integrity violation that had appeared on my updated transcript. They wanted comprehensive information about the plagiarism case before making any final decisions on my early decision application. He'd been forced to explain the entire situation over a 45-minute phone call, the copied article, the Honor Council hearing, my claims of being framed through account hacking. The admissions officer had thanked him professionally and said they'd be in touch with their decision soon. I asked directly what that meant for my application chances, and Professor Ashford's expression was genuinely sympathetic, but also brutally firm. He said honestly, realistically, my chances of acceptance at Hopkins were now effectively 0, regardless of how strong my credentials had been originally. No reputable medical school would accept a student with a plagiarism notation on their permanent transcript, regardless of whatever circumstances or explanations or claims of innocence accompanied it. The institutional risk to their reputation was simply too high. He said he was genuinely sorry because he'd really believed I had an exceptionally bright future in medicine, but this situation had completely destroyed those prospects. Something in his tone made me ask directly if he personally believed I had actually plagiarized that paper. He was quiet for a long moment, straightening papers on his desk that clearly didn't need straightening. Finally, he said, it didn't really matter what he personally believed at this point. The evidence that had been presented to the Honor Council was substantial enough for them to take the accusation seriously and make their ruling, and as a faculty member, he was obligated to support whatever decision the council reached. But then he added something that immediately caught my full attention. He mentioned that several students had come to his office over the past few days asking questions about my case, wanting to know specific details about what I'd supposedly done and what the consequences would be. I asked which students specifically had been asking about my case, and he hesitated before saying he probably shouldn't share that kind of information about other students. But then he mentioned, almost like he was thinking out loud, that Ethan Caldwell had been particularly curious and persistent. He'd stopped by the office twice this week, asking multiple detailed questions about exactly how plagiarism was detected by the university's software and what penalties the honor code prescribed for different severity levels. At the time, Professor Ashford had assumed Ethan was just academically interested in understanding the process, but now, looking directly at my face and seeing my reaction, he seemed to be reconsidering that initial interpretation. I told Professor Ashford directly that I believed Ethan had deliberately framed me, that someone had accessed my Google Docs account from the Grind coffee shop late at night and systematically swapped out my original work with plagiarized content from Dr. Foster's article. Professor Ashford leaned back in his chair and asked carefully if I had any actual proof connecting Ethan specifically to that unauthorized account access. I admitted I didn't have definitive proof yet, but I was actively working on gathering evidence that would demonstrate his involvement. He said I needed to be extremely careful about making serious accusations without having solid proof to back them up. False accusations against other students could result in their own separate honor code violations and make my situation exponentially worse than it already was. But then he did something completely unexpected. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the desk toward me with a meaningful look. Inside the folder were printed emails between him and Ethan from late November, right around the time when I'd been working on my ethics paper. The email chain showed Ethan asking Professor Ashford detailed questions about proper citation formats and whether paraphrasing required explicit attribution. Ashford had responded with thorough explanations of university plagiarism policies and best practices. Then a few days later, Ethan had sent another follow-up email specifically asking about the university's plagiarism detection software, wanting to know which databases and online sources it checked against when scanning submitted papers. Professor Ashford had responded explaining how the system worked, assuming Ethan was just being extra thorough about avoiding any accidental plagiarism in his own work. Reading through those emails, a clear picture started forming in my mind. Ethan had been systematically researching how to plagiarize successfully without getting caught, or more specifically, how to frame someone else for plagiarism in a way that would be virtually undetectable. He'd asked about the detection software to understand exactly how it functioned, which websites and databases it scanned, what kind of similarity scores would trigger automatic red flags. Then he'd found Dr. Foster's article that fit those parameters perfectly, copied large sections of it, and used my compromised Google account to insert them into my paper after I'd already submitted my original work. Professor Ashford watched me carefully as I read through the email chain and said he'd actually brought these messages to Dean Whitmore's attention during the Honor Council's deliberation process. The council had reviewed them, but ultimately determined they didn't constitute definitive proof of Ethan's involvement in my specific case. Students asked professors about plagiarism policies all the time, especially in upper-level seminars where the academic standards were rigorous. Being curious about how detection software worked wasn't inherently evidence of planning to commit academic dishonesty. The council would need concrete evidence directly linking Ethan to the unauthorized account access on December 2nd, which I hadn't been able to provide during the hearing. I asked Professor Ashford directly why he was showing me these emails now, after the council had already concluded their hearing and was in the deliberation phase. He said because something about this entire case had been bothering him significantly, that in 23 years of teaching he'd developed fairly reliable instincts about which students were genuinely capable of academic dishonesty and which ones weren't. I had never once triggered any concerns or red flags in his mind. Ethan, on the other hand, had always struck him as intensely competitive in ways that sometimes seemed to cross ethical boundaries. He couldn't help me in any official capacity given his position, but he thought I deserved to know about those emails and draw my own conclusions. I thanked him sincerely and left his office carrying copies of the email chain, feeling like I was slowly assembling a complex puzzle where half the pieces were still scattered and missing. I absolutely needed to connect Ethan to the Grind coffee shop on December 2nd specifically. Needed irrefutable proof that he'd been physically present there at 11:51 p.m. using their Wi-Fi to access my account. The problem was, I had absolutely no idea how to obtain that kind of proof without having subpoena power or any kind of legal authority to demand records. My phone rang as I was walking across campus back toward my apartment. Unknown number with a local area code. I answered cautiously and heard a professional woman's voice I didn't recognize asking if this was me. I confirmed my identity, and she introduced herself as attorney Rebecca Morrison, the education law specialist my dad had contacted on my behalf. She said she'd thoroughly reviewed all my case materials that my dad had forwarded and wanted to meet in person as soon as possible to discuss potential appeal options. Could I come to her office downtown within the next hour? Her office was located in a modern building near the county courthouse, third floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown area and distant mountains. Rebecca was probably in her mid-40s, wearing a sharp navy suit and radiating competence and no-nonsense efficiency. She had my entire case file spread across her conference table, including the Honor Council decision letter I hadn't even received yet, the Google Docs revision history screenshots, and the suspicious login information from my account security settings. She didn't waste time on small talk and got straight to business analyzing my situation. She said my case had several genuinely strong elements that could potentially support a successful appeal. The unauthorized account access from an unknown IP address was significant evidence suggesting I'd been deliberately framed rather than having committed plagiarism myself. The fact that my original paper had been systematically replaced several hours after I'd submitted it demonstrated clear evidence of sabotage. The timing of the login late at night when I would presumably be asleep showed planning and intent from someone who knew my personal schedule. These factors together created substantial reasonable doubt about my actual responsibility for the plagiarism that appeared in the submitted version. However, she continued with a more serious tone. The university's honor council system was specifically designed to favor finality of decisions and minimize disruption to the academic process. Appeal procedures were extremely limited and heavily deferential to the original council's ruling. We would need to demonstrate either clear procedural errors in how the hearing was conducted or present genuinely new evidence that definitively proved my innocence beyond any doubt. The login from the Grind coffee shop was highly suggestive, but not conclusive proof by itself. We needed something significantly stronger to overturn the council's decision if they ruled against me. I showed her Professor Ashford's email chain with Ethan asking detailed questions about plagiarism detection software and university policies. Rebecca read through them carefully, making notes on her yellow legal pad with the expensive-looking fountain pen. She said these emails helped establish Ethan's knowledge of how the detection systems functioned and his unusual interest in plagiarism mechanics right around the same time period when my paper was being sabotaged. Combined with the unauthorized login evidence, it started building a circumstantial case against him. But we still desperately needed direct evidence physically linking Ethan to that specific login event at the Grind on December 2nd. She asked if I had any ideas about how Ethan might have originally obtained my account password in the first place. I thought back to junior year when we'd still been close friends and study partners, spending countless hours together in the library and at each other's apartments. We'd often left our laptops open on the same desk while taking breaks to get food or coffee. Ethan was a computer science minor who frequently talked about security vulnerabilities and hacking techniques, always warning me about how easy it was to compromise someone's accounts if you weren't careful. It wouldn't have been particularly difficult for him to install keylogging software on my laptop during one of our study sessions, or simply observe me typing my password multiple times until he'd memorized it. Rebecca said that theory was entirely plausible, but would be virtually impossible to prove conclusively now, several months after the fact. What we absolutely needed was concrete evidence placing Ethan at the Grind coffee shop on December 2nd at the precise time of the unauthorized login. She asked if I had access to Ethan's social media accounts, or if we knew anyone who might have been with him that night and could serve as a witness. I pulled out my phone and checked Ethan's Instagram profile, scrolling back through his posts to early December. There were no posts from December 2nd itself, and no saved Instagram stories from that date either. But I noticed something potentially significant in a post from December 3rd, the morning after the unauthorized login. It was a photo of Ethan holding a coffee cup with the Grind's distinctive logo clearly visible on the side. The caption read, "Late night study sessions paying off," followed by a coffee cup emoji and a books emoji. The post timestamp showed 9:47 a.m. on December 3rd, which meant the photo could very well have been taken the previous night. Rebecca leaned forward across the conference table, examining the photo on my phone screen carefully. She said this was definitely interesting and helped establish that Ethan frequented the Grind as a study location. But it wasn't conclusive proof he was there specifically on December 2nd at 11:51 p.m. when my account was accessed. However, it did provide enough justification to subpoena the coffee shop's security footage if they had cameras, which most businesses did nowadays for basic theft prevention and liability purposes. She asked if I could think of anyone else who might have security footage from that night or any potential witnesses who could place Ethan at that specific location during the relevant time window. The Grind was a small, independently owned coffee shop, probably operating on tight margins without sophisticated security infrastructure. But Rebecca said even basic security cameras would be sufficient if the footage still existed. The challenge was obtaining that footage would require filing a formal subpoena, which meant we'd need to initiate a lawsuit against the university and potentially against Ethan personally. That process was expensive, time-consuming, and had no guarantee of success. She quoted me her hourly rate and estimated we'd be looking at $15,000 to $20,000 minimum to pursue this case aggressively through all available legal channels. My dad had money from his successful law practice, but $20,000 was still a substantial amount, even for our family. Rebecca said I should discuss it with my parents and decide quickly because security footage typically gets automatically overwritten after 30 to 60 days to save storage space. We were already almost 2 weeks past the December 2nd incident. If I wanted that footage preserved as potential evidence, we needed to act immediately before it disappeared forever. I called my dad from Rebecca's office lobby immediately after our meeting concluded. He answered on the first ring, clearly waiting for my call, and I explained everything that had happened. Professor Ashford's emails showing Ethan's suspicious questions about plagiarism detection, the Instagram photo showing the Grind coffee shop, Rebecca's professional assessment that we needed the security footage to build a definitive case. He was quiet for maybe 10 seconds, and then said in his firm lawyer voice to tell Rebecca to proceed immediately with filing the subpoena for the coffee shop footage. He'd wire her office the necessary retainer this afternoon. We absolutely were not going to let someone destroy my future without fighting back with everything we had. Rebecca filed all the necessary paperwork that same afternoon, requesting security footage from the grind for December 2nd, between 11 p.m. and midnight. She also filed a formal appeal with the university, arguing the Honor Council's decision was fundamentally flawed because they'd failed to adequately investigate clear evidence of unauthorized account access and potential frame-up by another student. The appeal process required the university to form an independent review committee that would examine the original hearing for procedural errors or evaluate any new evidence that emerged. The Honor Council's official decision arrived Thursday evening at 6:15 p.m. while I was sitting in my apartment pretending to study, but actually just staring at my textbook without processing any information. The email subject line said, Honor Council Decision, Case DIR 2847, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely click it open. The decision letter was extremely formal and lengthy, summarizing all the evidence that had been presented, describing their deliberation process in bureaucratic detail, and finally delivering their findings buried in paragraph 7. After careful review of all submitted evidence, including the revision history documentation and account access logs provided by the respondent, the Honor Council finds the respondent responsible for violating the academic integrity policy through deliberate plagiarism. The Council acknowledges the unusual circumstances surrounding the case, but cannot definitively establish that unauthorized access occurred based on available evidence. The specific penalties were detailed in the following paragraph with cold precision. Failing grade in advanced medical ethics. Permanent notation on my academic transcript describing the integrity violation in detail. 1-year suspension from Davidson University, effective immediately. I would need to formally reapply for admission after completing the suspension period, and my readmission would absolutely not be guaranteed. All current medical school applications would be officially notified of the academic integrity violation per university policy, as required. I read the decision letter 3 times before the full devastating weight of it finally crashed down on me with crushing force. 1-year suspension meant I couldn't graduate with my class in May, couldn't walk across the stage with my friends, couldn't celebrate 4 years of relentless hard work. The permanent transcript notation meant no medical school in the country would accept me, even if I somehow managed to return and graduate eventually. The notification to med schools meant my current applications to Hopkins, Stanford, and Penn were completely dead on arrival, destroyed before they'd even been fully reviewed. Devin found me still sitting motionless on my bed, staring at my laptop screen about an hour later when he got back from evening lacrosse practice. He read the decision letter over my shoulder and said this was absolutely insane, that I had clear proof someone else had accessed my account and the council was deliberately choosing to ignore it. He said we needed to fight this aggressively, appeal to the university president if necessary, get lawyers heavily involved, make enough noise that someone in authority would actually listen to the evidence instead of just blindly supporting the original flawed decision. His anger on my behalf should have felt validating, but I honestly just felt completely numb and hollowed out. My dad called at 8 p.m. sharp after I'd forwarded him the decision letter without any additional explanation. His voice had that tightly controlled fury I'd only heard maybe 3 or 4 times in my entire life growing up, usually when dealing with opposing counsel who deliberately crossed ethical lines in court proceedings. He said the university's decision was absolute garbage built on flawed reasoning, that the login from an unknown IP address was clear and obvious evidence of unauthorized access, and any reasonable investigator would immediately recognize that. He was contacting Rebecca first thing Friday morning, and we'd be filing a comprehensive appeal within the week with all available evidence. I told him I genuinely appreciated his support, but maybe we should just accept the decision and try to move on with our lives somehow. The fight ahead looked exhausting and expensive and heartbreaking, and even if we somehow won the appeal eventually, the permanent damage to my medical school chances was already done. Those admissions offices had already received notifications about my integrity violation. He said absolutely not, that rolling over and accepting false accusations when you're genuinely innocent was exactly how innocent people ended up with permanently destroyed reputations and derailed futures. We were fighting this because it was the right thing to do, and because someone had deliberately and maliciously sabotaged me, which meant there was a guilty party out there who needed to be exposed and held accountable for what they'd done. The security footage from the grind arrived via court-ordered release exactly 9 days after the appeal was officially filed with the university. Rebecca called me to her office immediately, saying I needed to see this right away. She had the footage queued up on her laptop, showing the interior of the coffee shop from multiple camera angles with timestamp displays in the corner. The video started at 11:30 p.m. on December 2nd. The shop was nearly empty at that late hour, just 2 students sitting at separate tables working on laptops and a bored-looking barista wiping down equipment behind the counter. At 11:47 p.m., Ethan walked directly into frame. He was wearing a dark blue Davidson hoodie with the university logo clearly visible and carrying his distinctive leather laptop bag. He ordered something from the barista, then walked to a corner table that was partially out of direct view from the counter. At 11:51 p.m. exactly, he opened his laptop and his hands started moving across the keyboard. The camera angle wasn't absolutely perfect, but you could definitely see his face clearly and identify the Davidson logo on his hoodie without any doubt. He worked intently on his laptop for approximately 8 minutes, then abruptly closed it, threw away his coffee cup in the trash bin near the door, and left the shop at 11:59 p.m. Rebecca paused the footage and turned to look at me with an expression of grim satisfaction. She said this was extremely strong evidence, probably strong enough to overturn the Honor Council's decision entirely. It definitively placed Ethan at the Grind coffee shop during the exact precise window when my account was accessed from that location's IP address. Combined with Professor Ashford's emails demonstrating Ethan's unusual interest in plagiarism detection mechanics, combined with the revision history showing my paper being altered after submission, this built an overwhelmingly compelling case that he had deliberately framed me. She was filing an amended appeal with the University Review Committee today, including this video evidence. I asked what realistically happened next in the process, and she explained the University Review Committee would be legally obligated to examine the security footage and make their own independent determination about whether it was sufficient evidence to overturn the original Honor Council decision. The committee had 15 days maximum to issue their official ruling per university policy. In the meantime, she was also filing a separate formal complaint against Ethan with the Honor Council, accusing him of deliberately sabotaging another student's academic work, which was itself classified as a serious integrity violation under university policy. The formal complaint against Ethan triggered its own separate Honor Council investigation into his conduct. Dean Whitmore called me directly 3 days after Rebecca filed all the paperwork, and her tone was notably different from our initial conversation during my hearing. She said the review committee was taking my appeal extremely seriously, given the substantial new video evidence that had been obtained. They were conducting supplemental interviews with all relevant parties, including Ethan, Professor Ashford, Gordon from IT Security, and potentially other students who might have relevant information. She asked if I could come in for a supplemental interview that afternoon to walk through exactly what had happened from my perspective, now that we had more complete information available. I agreed immediately and brought Rebecca with me this time, refusing to face another tribunal-style hearing without legal representation. The review committee consisted of 5 different people from the original Honor Council members, which Rebecca said was standard protocol to avoid bias from the initial decision. They asked extremely detailed questions about my entire relationship history with Ethan. When had we first become friends? When exactly had the friendship begun to sour? Had I noticed any suspicious or unusual behavior from him around the time when my ethics paper was due? I told them absolutely everything I could remember. How we'd been genuinely close friends until the competitive research position with Dr. Morrison had created serious tension between us. How Ethan had become increasingly hostile and competitive after I was selected. How I'd noticed him asking oddly specific questions about my study schedule and daily routines, about when I typically planned to submit major assignments. I pulled up text message conversations on my phone from late November showing Ethan asking what time I usually went to sleep on weeknights, claiming he wanted to know when it would be appropriate to text me with study questions without waking me up. At the time, I'd thought absolutely nothing of it, just assumed he was being considerate. Now, in retrospect, it looked exactly like him gathering intelligence about when I would be unconscious and unavailable to notice suspicious account activity. The committee chair, a law professor whose nameplate identified her as Professor Diaz, asked directly if I had any concrete evidence demonstrating how Ethan had originally obtained my Davidson account password. I explained my theory about him potentially installing keylogging software during our study sessions when we'd worked together closely, or possibly just observing me type my password enough times to memorize it, but I admitted honestly that I had absolutely no proof of either scenario. Professor Diaz nodded seriously and said they would be requesting comprehensive forensic analysis of both my laptop and Ethan's laptop to search for any evidence of unauthorized software installations or suspicious file transfers between our devices. 2 days later, Rebecca called me with extremely significant news that changed everything about the case. The university's IT department had conducted the requested forensic analysis of Ethan's laptop as part of the Honor Council's investigation. Deep in his deleted items folder, which he'd apparently thought was permanently erased, they'd found a text file containing what appeared to be my Davidson account password, along with account passwords for 3 other students who were all in our competitive pre-med program together. The file creation date was October 15th, approximately 6 weeks before my ethics paper had been sabotaged. This was direct, undeniable evidence that Ethan had been systematically collecting account credentials from multiple students, almost certainly planning to use them for sabotage when strategically opportune moments arose. Rebecca said this evidence was absolutely devastating to any defense Ethan might try to mount. There was now a completely clear chain of proof. He possessed my stolen password. He was physically present at the Grind during the precise moment of unauthorized login. He had demonstrated highly unusual interest in understanding exactly how plagiarism detection systems functioned. The review committee would have absolutely no choice except to overturn my plagiarism finding and hold Ethan fully responsible instead. The review committee issued their official ruling on day 14 of their deliberation period, 1 day before their maximum deadline. The decision letter was formal, but remarkably clear and direct. After thorough review of security camera footage, comprehensive forensic evidence analysis, and email correspondence between relevant parties, the committee finds that the respondent was wrongly accused of academic plagiarism. The preponderance of evidence strongly suggests the respondent's original work was deliberately sabotaged by another student through calculated, unauthorized account access. The original Honor Council finding is hereby vacated in its entirety. The failing grade is reversed and removed. The disciplinary notation is permanently deleted from the academic transcript. The respondent is immediately reinstated as a student in good standing with full privileges. The letter continued with detailed information about Ethan's separate case. Based on all evidence gathered during my appeal process, Ethan Caldwell had been formally charged with multiple severe honor code violations, including unauthorized access to student accounts, deliberate academic sabotage of another student's work, and providing false information to Honor Council investigators. His own formal hearing was scheduled for the following week. Preliminary discussions among council members suggested he was facing immediate expulsion from the university. I read the committee's decision at least 3 times before the reality of it actually sank into my exhausted brain. I was completely vindicated. My transcript was clean again. My suspension was lifted entirely. My academic standing was fully restored. But the serious damage to my medical school applications had already been done weeks ago. Hopkins, Stanford, and Penn had all been officially notified of the original plagiarism violation before it was overturned. Those admissions offices had probably already moved my application files to their rejection piles, written me off as a cheater, unworthy of admission to their prestigious programs. Rebecca moved with impressive speed, filing immediate formal notifications with all 3 medical schools within hours of receiving the review committee's decision. Her notifications included comprehensive explanations of the entire situation, attached the review committee's complete decision letter, included Professor Ashford's original strong recommendation letter, and added a powerful new letter from Dean Whitmore herself, expressing the university's profound regret for the wrongful accusation and unequivocally affirming my academic integrity and character. Rebecca said some medical schools might be willing to reconsider, given the truly extraordinary circumstances, but she emphasized she couldn't make any promises about outcomes. Ethan's Honor Council hearing happened on a Friday morning. I obviously wasn't allowed to attend since I was technically the victim in his case, but Devin kept texting me regular updates throughout the morning, based on information he was hearing from people who had connections to council members. The hearing apparently lasted over 3 hours and got extremely contentious. Ethan initially tried to deny everything completely, claiming someone else must have somehow planted the password file on his laptop, and that he'd merely coincidentally been at the grind that specific night for completely legitimate studying purposes. But when directly confronted with the comprehensive forensic evidence, the security footage showing him at the exact time and location of the unauthorized login, and Professor Ashford's emails demonstrating his unusual research into plagiarism detection mechanics, his entire defense story collapsed under scrutiny. The council deliberated for less than an hour before reaching their verdict. They found Ethan responsible for all charges brought against him. The penalty was immediate expulsion from Davidson University, effective that same day. All his academic credits from the current semester were completely invalidated. His permanent academic transcript would explicitly reflect the expulsion and provide detailed description of the honor code violations that caused it. Any medical schools he'd applied to would receive official notification of his expulsion and the reasons behind it. His academic career and his dream of becoming a doctor were completely and permanently over. I felt absolutely no satisfaction or vindication hearing about Ethan's expulsion from multiple sources that afternoon. Just profound exhaustion and lingering anger that he'd deliberately put both of us through this absolute nightmare in the first place. His competitive jealousy and inability to handle academic setbacks had nearly destroyed my entire future, and had definitely destroyed his own future completely. All because he fundamentally couldn't handle losing a single research position and receiving a slightly lower grade on one ethics paper compared to mine. Professor Ashford personally called me to his office the Monday following Ethan's expulsion. He offered a formal and heartfelt apology for not recognizing earlier that something was seriously wrong with the plagiarism accusations against me. He said he'd been too focused on the overwhelming statistical evidence from the detection software and hadn't paid enough attention to his own knowledge of my character and work ethic developed over an entire semester of close interaction. He'd already personally contacted all 3 medical schools I'd applied to, explaining the complete situation in detail and vouching unequivocally for my integrity and potential as a future physician. He couldn't guarantee they would reconsider my applications, but he'd done absolutely everything within his power to repair the damage that had been done. Hopkins responded first, about 2 weeks later. The admissions committee had thoroughly reviewed my case and all the additional documentation provided by Professor Ashford and Attorney Morrison. They had decided to keep my application in active consideration for their incoming MD class, despite the significant disruption and confusion. They acknowledged the truly extraordinary circumstances and noted that the university's formal reversal of the plagiarism finding had adequately addressed their initial concerns about academic integrity. My application would be reviewed using my original credentials and qualifications, including Professor Ashford's exceptionally strong recommendation letter. A final admissions decision would be communicated with their regular notification cycle in March. Stanford and Penn sent remarkably similar responses within days of each other. Both schools expressed that they were genuinely impressed with how I'd fought systematically to clear my name and expose the truth, despite facing enormous institutional pressure. Both were willing to fully reconsider my application with fresh eyes. Neither school offered any guarantees of acceptance, but they'd given me back the fair chance I'd earned through 4 years of relentlessly hard work and dedication. My dad called the night I received the Hopkins email, and his voice was thick with emotion I very rarely heard from him in our conversations. He said he was incredibly proud of how I'd handled this impossible situation, proud that I'd chosen to fight back against false accusations, instead of just accepting them and trying to rebuild my life elsewhere. He said most people in my position would have completely given up, would have accepted the suspension and tried to transfer to a different university and start over. But I'd stood my ground firmly and proven the system could actually work properly when you had solid evidence and unwavering determination. March 15th finally arrived after months of agonizing waiting. I sat in my apartment with Devin present for moral support and my dad on speakerphone from his office. I opened the Hopkins admissions portal first, my hands literally shaking as the page loaded. The very first word on the screen was, "Congratulations," in large, bold letters. I'd been accepted to their MD program with a substantial merit scholarship covering nearly half my tuition. Devin immediately started shouting loud enough that our downstairs neighbors definitely heard through the floor. My dad's voice cracked with emotion as he said he'd always known I would succeed. Stanford's decision notification arrived exactly 1 hour later. Also accepted. Also with scholarship funding. Penn's decision came that same evening just before midnight. Accepted there as well with their standard financial aid package. I had 3 top-tier medical schools offering me guaranteed places in their incoming classes for next fall. Everything that Ethan had tried so desperately to destroy, every opportunity he'd attempted to steal from me through deliberate sabotage, had ultimately come back even stronger than before. The honor code that had briefly and terrifyingly turned against me had ultimately worked exactly as designed, protecting innocent students and punishing those actually guilty of violations. It had just taken significantly longer and required far more fighting than anyone should ever need to give to prove their innocence.